Okay. So today's talk is going to be from the people at Globus. It's going to be Rachana, and she is going to be talking a little bit about some of the new features that were added during the last release cycle. I think specifically talking about some of the more privacy enabling features that will enable sensitive data sharing, and probably a couple other things as well. So I will turn it over to you, Rachana, and let me know if you're able to actually try to share your screen, and we'll get going.
Okay, thanks, Jason.
All right, you're good to go.
Okay, thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to focus on this talk on the recent release we have, well, not so recent, it's been a few months now, on using Globus for protected data management. And as a part of this, I'll highlight some of the work we are doing with a new version of the Globus Connect Server and talk a little bit about that also in this talk. So let's see here. I could move. So the Globus essentially released support for managing protected data and providing higher assurance levels for managing regulated data. The classic use cases or the motivation for this was being able to use the data management capability, manage transfers, collaborative data sharing, and all of that with any of the data that requires higher levels of assurance and that requires compliance with higher security levels, right? So we had requirements from campuses and researchers at large, where if they were handling data on separate enclaves, let's say that was regulated by HIPAA, or they were touching data that required higher NIST security standards for management, they wanted to be able to use all of the Globus services against such data to be able to do, move, share, all of the capabilities that the Globus data management platform provides. There was also requirements for using Globus within HIPAA-regulated environments. So we have an option for you to get a business associate agreement with us, so Globus can be deployed in HIPAA-regulated environment. Specifically, the data sets we are looking at are some examples of data sets we are looking at are protected health information, personally identifiable information, controlled but unclassified, and so on. So these are just examples of some of the data types that motivated this and the security standards we've had to comply with to make Globus available for these sorts of data. The process itself, it's been about a year and a half, engaging with the University of Chicago's CISO office. So as most of you are aware, Globus is a division within the University of Chicago. So ultimately, that's the legal entity for us. And we worked with their CISO office and to comply with University of Chicago's security controls. They are based on NIST 853 low and are a superset of the 800-171 low. So these are useful things to sort of note here. The examples of data types I have above are just that, they're just examples. If you have other grants or other data processing agreements that require you to comply with various NIST standards, Globus could be used in those scenarios, and you can see what level of operational security we provide there. For people who have data that is HIPAA regulated, we also provide business associate agreements. The agreement is between University of Chicago and your institution, the subscriber institution. And the BAAs are chains. So we ourselves, University of Chicago has a business associate agreement with Amazon, given all of the Globus services run on AWS, right? So you should be able to use the data transfer, the data management capabilities, both transfer and sharing in HIPAA-regulated environments with the BAA option. So touching a little bit on restricted data disclosure to Globus, Globus, the architecture is such that Globus never sees the file contents. We never have. And the data always moves from source to the destination. Globus only sees file names and has control channels. So with the with this support, file paths and file names can also have restricted data in them, because we are now compliant to the standards that allows us to have that. So for example, it's very common in clinical research or people who are working in that space to add PHI in file names. So now with the new support that we have, such data can also be managed using Globus. None of the other elements like the names of your endpoints or collection definitions, those are not expected to have any restricted data or cannot have it. Whereas the file contents can, and then the file paths and the file names can have any restricted information. So the first release of this was August of last year, and it pretty much includes all of our production services, Globus Auth, transfer, sharing, our group service, which can be used to share data with groups of people. All of that is in scope. Do have to use a newer version of Globus Connect Server, and I'll talk about that a little bit in this presentation. It's version 5, which is a major version upgrade from 4. So you have to use version 5.2 or above for managing data that's on with the higher assurance. We also released a new version of Globus Connect Personal. So those of you who run either Windows machines or laptops or what have you, we also have a new version of Globus Connect Personal that can handle data with higher assurance requirements, our Globus web app, and our CLI. So all of that is in scope for the release and can be used. We also have additional storage connectors. So if you do have restricted data in addition to POSIX, if you have restricted data on, let's say, Google Drive or AWS S3, Ceph or Box, all of that can also be used with this product offering. So I'll note that if you have PHI data in any of those cloud providers, the institution has to have its own business associate agreement with the cloud provider, independent of Globus, right? So if you have data in Box that has potentially PHI, then you would have to have your own agreements with Box on that. So this is the initial set. The plan is that we will move all connectors that Globus supports into the higher assurance tier, so you should be able to use them. A few of the older versions are not in scope. Globus ID versions 4 of Globus Connect Server cannot be used with higher assurance. You'd have to use the newer versions. The latest release on 5 is Globus Connect version 5, which has all the support for the high assurance that I'm talking about, and also supports all of these connectors. So you could have a single install with multiple of these connectors. And that's if you're looking to try out any of the high assurance features I'm talking about today, this is the version that you would install and try. So I want to talk a little bit about version 5 architecture, and how that differs or what the changes are from version 4. So I'll start with sort of a layer diagram that describes what version 5 looks like, and then I'll speak about the various terminology, right? So to begin with, the data transfer nodes, none of that has changed. You still have data transfer nodes that install Globus Connect Server software. These nodes should be installed ideally in Science DMZs, high performant for moving data in and out. So that becomes sort of the base layer to start with. And then Globus Connect Server software is installed on these nodes. And then a logical layer on top of it is the endpoint, right? So when you have multiple nodes, each of those nodes have installations of Globus Connect Server, but then Globus sees a logical layer that you can create called the endpoint, which will be used for configuration of servers, network configuration. So for example, how much concurrency and parallelism can this endpoint tolerate, and so on, right? So the endpoint in GCS5 is an admin-only construct. So we expect only the administrators to have to access it and manage it and so on. Once you have the endpoint, then you would add in the connector for the particular storage system that you want. So in this case, we are adding in a POSIX connector that can speak to any POSIX storage system, and then create what we call storage gateways. These are rough equivalents to mount points and policies on who can access those and how the access can be done, right? So for example, in this picture, you see two storage gateways against the same storage system. One is a /project gateway that has some policies around it. And then another one is mounted on /scratch, and it has its own policies around it, right? So the storage gateways allows you to have a single large storage system, but still partition it logically to allow multiple policies and ways people access that. Right? With version 5, you can have a single endpoint and multiple types of storage. So if you are using Google Drive or S3, you don't have to get separate independent servers for that. You can drop in the connector that speaks that particular storage system type, and you can create storage gateways. So this one here, for example, is a Google Drive storage gateway that requires users to log in with an identity from @domain.edu. Right? So the administrator not only sets the endpoints, they also set up these storage gateways that talk about which part of the storage system they can access and who can access the storage there, right, via Globus. Then the last part of that puzzle is collections, which provides the data interface. That is what users use for accessing actual data, and version 5 supports both grid FTP and HTTPS access to the data. So the same security, access control, authorization applies, whether you come in using grid FTP for bulk transfer or you come in using HTTPS to access the data, right? So we have sort of separated the notions of endpoint being from GCS4 into two things, collections and endpoints. And endpoints really are what admins manage. Collections is what users look at for accessing the data. Just like in version 4, we support two modes of access. One is where you have a local account and you log into the endpoint using your credentials, and you're dropped into your local account and you're accessing data there. We call those mapped collections. And in the other access is where sharing is done, where you don't have a local account, but somebody has shared a folder with you. In V4, those were called shared endpoints. In the new version, we're calling it guest collections, right? Where you're a guest on that endpoint, you do not have a local account for accessing it. And the storage gateway determines whether you're allowed to create guest collections and who's allowed to create it and so on. So for example, in the second storage gateway here, which is on /scratch, the policy pretty much only allows mapped collections. So only people with local accounts can access it, and you cannot share data off that storage gateway. Right? So that's what binds it. So looking at terminology changes, if you're a V4 user today and you're using host endpoints, these are called mapped collections in the new terminology. If you do using shared endpoints where no local account is needed, those are called guest collections. It used to be we would go to host endpoints to create a shared endpoint. In the new architecture, you would find the storage gateway of choice and create collections, guest collections. In V4, access was only via grid FTP. In V5, all data is accessible using grid FTP and HTTPS. And you should be able to use the same security authorization and access control when accessing the data. Okay, so this should be fixed. It's available in V5.3 is the latest version of that. Right? I just want to reiterate for people who have been using version 4 and Globus for a number of years that the conceptual model remains the same. The mapped collections work exactly how host endpoints used to work, in a sense that the data still just uses the data channel between source and destination. We still take the user identity and map it to a local account, and the local account security permissions are honored. So none of those things have changed in terms of the security model. And similarly with guest collections, right? If you recall, this is where there is somebody who has a local account shares the data with an external collaborator by putting some permissions in Globus. And Globus essentially overlays those permissions and ensures that the external user has access just to that folder or that set of files. So none of those models have changed, and we still have a layered security model where the institutional security policies are combined with these things, and access is controlled that way. Right? So we continue to do point releases of version 5. The initial motivation, first thing that was released was Google Drive, but since then we've started to add more and more features around high assurance and supporting multiple connectors against the same endpoint and so on. We expect to do further releases around multi-VPN support, additional storage systems, and then have a release where V5 will be ready for users of V4 to migrate, right? That will have feature parity plus all the nice features that V5 provides that was not in V4. And at that point, we expect to provide all the migration tools and have a parallel support period for while all the customers migrate over to the new version, right? Okay, so now that I've talked about V5, kind of coming back to the high assurance features, right? So what were the additional features that we added to enable Globus use with protected data? There are 4 key things that was done. So the first one was supporting additional authentication assurance. So this allowed a administrator at a gateway level, storage gateway level, to be able to flag that the storage gateway has high assurance data that requires high assurance, and also set stricter authentication policies, which force the user to authenticate with a specific identity within a specific time, right? So that was a big part of a feature addition, and what it takes to guide the user through the whole thing. So if you come in through the Globus UI, how do you recognize the policy and help the user navigate that policy, right? Then the second one was session or device isolation. So this is really thinking about it, approximating it to a browser session, where the security context or the authentication context for a user is per application per session, right? So if I'm accessing an endpoint from, let's say, the Globus web app, and then I activate it, and then I go to my Globus CLI, I have to demonstrate authentication all over again to access that data, right? The interesting aspect of this is because Globus is based on security standards like OAuth, there are, and we have a platform, there can be multiple applications that access this endpoint, right? So Globus has a web app, so do other groups who have developed their own portals and web applications to access these things. So the session isolation not only provides application level isolation, it also provides OAuth app level isolation, right? So you can, when you come in, if one of the apps is compromised, then the other one, there's complete isolation on the security context, and you won't be able to access the endpoint from another one. The third aspect of it is encryption. Globus always has had an option to enable encryption of all the data that is flowing on the wire. With high assurance, the encryption is enforced. So pretty much once the storage gateway has been marked high assurance, we automatically encrypt everything that goes on the wire. And then the last piece is audit logging, ensuring that the institutions that are using Globus for high assurance have complete audit logging information for them to be able to see how the data was accessed and such. And all of this is stored at your institution on the endpoint, right? So these are sort of 4 product features that were released and that made it possible for Globus to be used in a high assurance environment. So I'll walk through a few schematic and I'll do a quick demo on this. So let's posit somebody is logged into the Globus web app using their Argon identity, right? And they're accessing an endpoint. This is not a high assurance endpoint, and they're able to log in. They have to log in with the credentials for the endpoint, and they're able to access it. If they access a high assurance endpoint, they will be forced to meet the higher authentication requirement. Even if they've logged in with that credential before, and if it is timed out, they'll be forced to log in again, right? So Globus recognizes the policy, walks the user through it, explaining why they have to log in again, takes them through the federated login process, and then they have access to it for them to be able to browse and initiate transfers. Now, if I sit on the screen for a while and I've hit the authentication timeout, I'll be forced to do that over again, right? So that's the next part of that. So there is an authentication timeout the admin sets. Then the third aspect was the isolation. So let's say I'm accessing a high assurance collection, and I've logged in and I've just logged in correctly and I have access to it. If I access the same collection from another application, for example, the Globus CLI, it is going to have me go through the whole thing again because the security context is isolated. And if I'm in the same browser and accessing the same endpoint from a different app, so this is another app that has been written against the Globus APIs, I'll still be asked to authenticate again. So there's isolation at the OAuth app level here. The security policies I described are not just for pieces that have access to data, it is also for pieces that lead to access to data, right? So in this example, here is a user who wants to grant rights to another user on an shared endpoint. In this case, because it could ultimately lead to higher assurance data access, all of these management tasks, including managing permissions, requires these higher assurance, right? So the user gets redirected to their UChicago account, they log in, they grant access to this user to read. And if the user gets a notification and attempts to log in using one of their linked identities, they'll be denied access and they'll go through a workflow to get the right identity to demonstrate that they have the UChicago login and have permission to read it, right? So anything that has data access, anything that could lead to data access, all of that has the same requirements. And if you're an administrator of any Globus endpoint, when you deal with high assurance endpoints, high assurance collections, all of your administrative actions will also require that you authenticate and meet the high bar for authentication, right? Whether it is for Globus groups, which can be used to set permissions to data, or you're looking at the Globus management console to see logs of transfers, which could have file names and such, so that could have PHI, or if you're looking at managing your endpoint configuration, all of those things will require you to authenticate with the right identity and meet the higher bar for security, right? So I'll just do a quick demo here. One of the big focus areas for us as we went through and developed this was to ensure that the user experience remained frictionless for people who are using Globus. And I make that statement both for users who are using high assurance and for users who have nothing to do with high assurance, right? So we ensured that these policies are very fine-grained and apply only to collections that require such additional authentication and additional burden of proof. So users who are using Globus with regular data that still is authorized and authenticated and has security, but doesn't need these additional steps, just use it as they've always done before, right? So this is a standard Globus web app. So it's app.globus.org. I'm going to first log in with my Globus staff credentials, which is underlying it's really a Google account. So I authenticate with that. And if you notice here, if I go to my account page, you see that I have my UChicago identity and my Globus identity linked together. So it's a single entity within Globus. So if I go back in here and pick one of the collections, which is a high assurance collection, you can see those by these green locks. So it's a visual indicator that, these are higher security ones. So if I pick that, you notice now the authentication piece kicks in, and it's going to say, although it's all a single account linked together, I have to log in with my UChicago account in order to access that information. So I can click on that. It tells me which account and why I'm asked to log in. And then I authenticate with my UChicago account. At this point, I had just logged in, so it didn't show me my UChicago login. But at this point, we're really going off to the federated IDP, to the institutional IDP, right? So the institution determines, how long to keep cookies, determines if MFA is required. For example, UChicago uses Duo. So you could do all of those things at your IDP, and then it comes back, and now I have access to the data, although it's a high assurance collection. So if I sit on this for a little while, I think we have a timeout about 10 minutes. It's going to, again, kick me back through the flow. So I have to demonstrate that I have access to it. You will notice that this is the case for any activity on these endpoints. So here's sharing on a high assurance endpoint where this data can be shared with any other user. So I'll share it with VAS. Let's say given, right. So if I were to come and do this, all of this requires that I use my UChicago account. Now, in this case, I've shared with VAS at globus.org his Globus identity. When VAS attempts to access this, it is going to force him to authenticate with his Globus identity. So he has to prove he has this particular identity, even if it is linked with UChicago or Argonne. He has to come in and demonstrate that he has this identity. Right? Now, if I'm an administrator and I'm managing roles, I'm managing transfers, all of those things have very similar things. Now I'll look at groups for a second. So I mentioned that anything that could lead to access also has higher assurance. Groups in Globus could lead to access to data. So if I go back to my permissions, rather than give individual users permissions, I could give a group permission to the data. So for example, I could give demo group read permission on this data, right? So because groups are part of that, we have notions of groups that are also high assurance. So this example is one, which is a strict group. And these groups come with their own authentication requirements. How often do you have to log in? And only an admin can make invites. So there are restrictions on how the membership to the group is controlled and what the policies on the group are. So if I go in here, you can see this group is a strict group. And as an admin, I have to authenticate within so many minutes every time to prove that I have access to this group, right? So we have built a general purpose high assurance feature that provides all the session and authentication context handling into our Globus Auth service, which underlies all of our security for all of our services. So we built that in, and then the Globus services on top of it leverage that and enforce policies. Right. Okay, I'll go back to my deck here. So I just showed you this one, groups that have high assurance, and any changes to the group policy also has that. And if any of you use subgroups in Globus, the subgroups also inherit the high assurance policy. So the whole tree gets the policy. Okay, so those pieces were really features in the product that your users see and interact with when you enable this on your endpoints. But what about security features on the endpoint itself, right? When you install Globus Connect Server, create an endpoint and flag something as high assurance, what sorts of security features are there, right? And this is over and above. This only highlights a few things. We have baselines for these things with 4. So the first thing in the model, the data always remains at the institution. Globus never sees it. It's not hosted by Globus, right? That's always been the case and continues to be the case. We automatically do integrity checks of the transferred data. So you're assured that the data at the destination was checked with the data at the source, right? And then I alluded to encryption. So all communication of and the data in transit is completely encrypted, right? The communication is always encrypted. The data in some cases was optional, but with high assurance, the data is always encrypted. We often get asked about the encryption algorithm. It really is determined by your deployment. So when you deploy Globus Connect Server, whatever you configure in your OpenSSL libraries is what determines what encryption algorithm is used. So the ciphers you set up, and if you have to be FIPS 120 compliant, what you set up there is what determines the encryption strength and that, right? So this actually is an interesting place to talk about a shared responsibility model. With the high assurance product, or the security model is really a shared responsibility between Globus and the institution, because there is a piece of software and a service that you're running at your site that provides the access and needs to be configured correctly. And then we have our own set of hosted services that have that, right? So this is one great example where the local configuration is enabling something as a feature that Globus provides. And then the last point here is access control. If you're current users, you know that Globus has fine-grained access control, acts only as an identity broker, does not sort of mint new identities or anything like that. And it's a layered security model. So the institution has complete control over all the access control and who can access what data, which parts of the data is accessible to the Globus ecosystem, and so on. And all those access policies are respected. And if you're using Globus sharing, we do allow additional access policies to be layered on top of it and stored in Globus, but it still is constrained by what is configured at the endpoint. So if you're installing Globus Connect version 5, which we hope many of you will do, it looks a little different from v4. So I'll walk through the steps and highlight some differences. So the first one is standard. We have binaries for all kinds of platforms. So you would go pick up the binary of your choice. And in v4, if you've done the installation, you would need to use a Globus ID username and password. And that has been removed in v5. With v5, you would register the endpoint at developers.globus.org because we use OAuth security for the installation itself. So just to sort of show you that web app, so developers.globus.org is the application, and you see an option here for registering a new Globus Connect Server version 5. And the registration will look, so I'll do a very quick, you would say add a new Globus Connect Server, and you provide your endpoint display name here. So, demo endpoint 1, and then it walks you through the steps on how to register it, and it gives you the credentials for your endpoint. So here is the client ID, and you can create a secret. That is what is used for authenticating with the Globus system as you go through the registration. So we've removed and eliminated the need for a Globus ID username and password, but allowed you to create this client ID and secret. These secrets can be rotated. You could have multiple admins for this project. So other admins in your system also have access to it and can make updates to configuration and such, right? So if any of you have done app development with OAuth, that's exactly what you're doing here. You're registering a server. So once you register it, you will need that client ID and secret I showed you there for rest of these steps. Then you would add the connectors. So if you have POSIX as default, it comes with installation. If you need other types of connectors, for example, if you're using Box, you would add that connector in. And then decide storage gateways, right? You decide create new storage gateways. And the storage gateways, like I said, are points in your file system that you want to expose out as a logical unit. It can have policies that determine what kind of collections, is somebody allowed to do guest collections on it? Is somebody allowed to do only mapped collections? So you decide those pieces. And that is where you would configure if the storage gateway needs higher assurance features. And there are additional steps after that. But if you set a storage gateway as high assurance, all collections on top of that storage gateway are assumed to be high assurance, right? And will enforce the policy on that. So as an admin, you have an endpoint, you drop in the connectors, which is really binaries for talking to the various systems, various storage systems. You create these storage gateways. And then the last step, if you want to, you would add a mapped collection and determine how the user must log in, right? So this is equivalent to any host endpoint you have today. So in this case, for example, at UChicago, our storage cluster, we log in with our UChicago credentials. So you would create a mapped collection and then say the policy is that the user must log in with @uchicago.edu. And we use that identity to map to a local account name. And then the user gets access, right? So the steps are outlined in good detail in this installation guide. It walks you through, all of these steps and setting up all these policies. We also have a separate guide for people who are looking to do high assurance, to talk about the additional steps or additional things you need to think about when you enable high assurance at your campus. So that's the GCS5 installation. And just a very quick snapshot, I talked about audit logs. So we have beefed up audit logging all across the system, but especially at the DTNs. So when you install version 5, the audit logs that are written have all the information you need to reconstruct all activity that has any access to data, right? Who accessed, what time, all of that. So you can completely reconstruct access to your file system using the audit log information there. We've seen cases where people are taking this and essentially dropping the information into their favorite log analyzer. We have seen this moved, added to Splunk, whatever system that you use to monitor and analyze your logs. Just be able to take this and then drop it into that into your log analysis tools. A little bit on Globus Connect Personal. So there are two use cases for it. One is probably the obvious one. Globus Connect Personals are typically used by users on their laptops, like personal use laptops, desktop machines. And there is sufficient demand where the laptop is managed and it's authorized for use with high assurance data that users want to have a Globus Connect Personal on it so they can move the data. The second use case for it is Windows machines. So we do have data that is pulled from instruments where the first machine that's sitting right there is a Windows machine, in which case Globus Connect Personal is used to handle the data. And if that data also has PHI in it or PI or restricted data, then you need a Globus Connect Personal that's capable of doing high assurance, right? So we released a new version of it. 3.x is the new version. It looks awfully similar to 2.x. You should see no difference in your user experience. You download the binary, you set it up. If you have 2.x, you can upgrade to 3.x without much trouble. It asks you one question though, which is to choose one of the identities from your linked identity to associate with that endpoint. So in my case, I showed you I have UChicago and my Globus account linked together. When I install the new GCP for high assurance, it'll ask me to pick one of those two identities. And whichever one I pick, and I come back to that endpoint, I have to authenticate with that identity to access the data. Once you have it set up, you still have to go to your organization subscription manager to enable it for high assurance, right? It has to be covered under your organization subscription. Only then can you put restricted data on it or use that endpoint. But the setup looks very similar to a regular GCP. We also beefed up the logging on the Globus Connect Personal side of the house, so you can get complete audit logging on that also. Everything else works the same. You could use that for sharing data if you would choose. You could also use it to move data between Globus Connect Personal to another Globus Connect Personal. All of the functionality remains the same. It just will force you to authenticate more often and such. Okay, so we talked a lot about product features, what your users will see when you make this available. We talked some about as an admin, what will you see, how do you install something new, and what features do you get as an admin. The last part of the puzzle is what we had to do for the hosted services that Globus has to meet these requirements. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of operational requirements placed on us based on the NIST standards and meeting those things. So we have spent quite a bit of effort improving a lot of our operational aspects and complying to the higher security levels, right? VPNs were set up for better remote access control, intrusion detection and prevention systems. Health monitoring was beefed up. We had to make sure that everything, all our logging and everything at rest on our side is encrypted. So essentially, a lot of the operational aspects that you would do if you're in a HIPAA-controlled environment. We heavily leveraged Amazon's best practices for securing such environments. So we use VPCs and AWS security groups and the IAM solutions that AWS has, isolation of accounts. So we've done quite a bit on beefing up all of these operational pieces on our services to meet the NIST standards. And we've always had isolated environments for production, integration, staging, and testing. And so that helped us. So we really had to focus on our production environment and beef up all of these services across the board for that, right? We do have the documents around this. So system security plans and contingency plans and the whole security document packets that anyone who's looking at a high assurance or a BAA subscription could get access to for evaluation. Right? Okay, that brings me probably to my last slide here. So all of the features for high assurance are available under a new subscription tier. So we've always had our standard subscription, which gives you unlimited access to all of the features. For the high assurance tier, there are two tiers actually. The first one is a high assurance tier, which gives you access to all the features that I've talked about today. Again, you could use them against your standard POSIX storage system or any of the other connectors that you may have. And that's at 33% on the standard subscription pricing. If you are in a HIPAA regulated environment and you also need a business associate agreement for using Globus, then we also have a second tier, which is the BAA tier, that involves working with our legal and getting a business associate agreement signed. And that also obviously includes all the features on in the high assurance tier. So it just adds that legal facet so that the BAAs involve liability and breach notification and such, and all of that comes as a part of that last tier. So I'll leave this slide up and we have some time for questions here. I'll highlight a few things. One, there is a document that describes the new terminology and new ways of doing this thing, which is using Globus Connect version 5. So the architecture diagram that I broke down for this presentation is there in the document, and it walks you through all the different pieces and such. We also have a high assurance guide that provides both sort of guidelines on what sorts of things you need to think about when you do this and policies, but also how to use Globus in that environment. Talks a little bit about the shared responsibility models I talked about. And then lastly, the more nuts and bolts of this, there is a document for GCS 5 installation. 5.3 is the latest version for using with this, and that does a very detailed walkthrough of every step that I had in my single slide, right? Getting your binaries, registering it, adding any storage connectors that you want, and setting up policies on those storage connectors, creating mapped collections, and so on. And there are also how-to guides for end users on using something like this for creating guest collections and such. So all of this is on docs.globus.org. And the documentation has details to guide anyone through any of this. And as always, you can email us at support@Globus if you have any questions or if you need help setting anything up or you run into trouble with this. So, okay, with that, I will stop. Any questions? We have a few minutes that I can take questions and answer.
All right, well, thank you so much for going through all of that. So I had a couple to get us started, and then if anybody else wants to ask questions, you can either unmute if you're in a quiet location or type it into the chat room and I'll repeat it. So with regards to when you're operating in the special mode, is there any visual indication on the Globus Connect personal side that will give you sort of a heads up that you are or you aren't? I'm just thinking about this in terms of, whenever I open up a piece of software and if I needed to make sure that I was connected to my VPN or something like that, I can look up in my status bar and know that, okay, yes, I am on my VPN. It's safe to do whatever I need to do. Does the Globus Connect Personal give you that sort of indication?
That's a great question. All of the indication that we have is through the Globus UI, because there is only so much you can do on the Globus Connect Personal itself. But it might be interesting. We could add another element to the personal that is on your laptop to show that it's been configured high assurance. Today, everything is on the Globus UI. So when you pull up your laptop on the Globus UI, it'll have a big green lock on it that tells you that it's in a high assurance mode. But that's an interesting idea to make sure that even the install on your laptop has some indication.
Okay, well that answers my second question then. So it is something that shows up in the Globus Connect UI, or the UI itself, and
Right.
then I'm guessing it's also on whichever end it's happened to be enabled on, or would it just be one
That's correct.
indication
Yeah.
for both ends? Okay.
No, so it's whichever end it's in. So anywhere you interact with a storage gateway or a collection that is enabled for high assurance, whether you're in an admin mode or a user mode, it's the green lock that shows up, right? And similarly for groups, if you're dealing with groups that are high assurance, you will see a green lock that tells you that it's a high assurance group.
Okay. So I have a second and probably more darker question. Since people are going to have to be entering into the business arrangement with University of Chicago, if I have that right,
Mm-hmm.
in the event that something bad does happen, what's sort of the mitigation path that the end site or the end user would have to take to sort of get to a remediation? Is it dealing with the University of Chicago then, or
No.
the sites that were involved in anything bad that happened?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first, I want to clarify that you would do a BAA only if you're in a HIPAA regulated environment or your legal tells you need a BAA. And that lays forth sort of liability sharing plus contractual breach notification. So if Globus knows there was a breach, how quickly we would let you know and things like that, right? So that's part of the BAA. The reason you're doing the BAA with University of Chicago is because they are the legal entity. We are just a division within University of Chicago. And if indeed something were to happen, the first thing would be through Globus. So the University of Chicago has a dedicated cyber information security officer for Globus and a legal person who we start our consult with. So the way I envision something like this going would be definitely that you would reach out to Globus and we would then investigate it with you and get the CISO's office and UC legal involved. We have outlined procedures for what the steps are if something like that were to happen, right? When do we have to go to them and who gets involved and so on. So it's definitely still Globus and you're not directly dealing with, University of Chicago. You're not dealing with any other division in University of Chicago. You're still coming to us for working on that.
Okay, well, that answers my questions. I'll give another pause here. Nobody has asked anything else in the chat room. So thank you again for giving this today. Make sure you send me a copy of the slides. I'll make sure those get uploaded.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jason.
Yep. Thank you. And I don't see any more typing, so I think we'll call it for today. Just a programming note. Let me look at my notes here. Next week, it's going to be Tom DeFonte talking about PRP. So if anybody wants to attend that, same time, same place on the 24th. So hope everybody has a good weekend. We'll talk to y'all soon.